there's no evidence here at all that inappropriate overtime was given out. Certainly not pervasively. Certainly not as a systematic type of abuse. In fact, the entire report says the opposite if you look at it in totality. So I think that was kind of a loaded way to say it, that whatever amount of inappropriate overtime was given out, when no evidence suggests that. And you agreed with that statement, and that's a flawed beginning to the statement. And in fact, I do want to point out that the drivers of the overtime that you're raising, that's nothing new. In the May meeting and the June meeting, the agency presidents all laid out in detail, as did Bob Ferran, the drivers of the overtime. Everybody around here knows why the overtime went up. So when you say there are drivers to the overtime, you talk about fast forward and the subway action plan and save seconds, everybody here knows that, and it's not new ground. It was laid out by the agency presidents that this overtime was necessary to get the system back into a state of good repair. And in fact, every one of the agency presidents said they do not believe that there was a common thread of fraud or overtime abuse within the allotment of that overtime. So it's absolutely incorrect to infer from this report that there was inappropriate overtime doled out. And I think that's how some of these problems began with. And just a little bit of history here is that the Empire Center, which, as one of the speakers commented, is a Koch brothers right-wing think tank, issued a report around April 24th saying that the overtime went up dramatically at the MTA. Well, of course the overtime went up dramatically at the MTA. This entire system fell into a state of crisis that we're now only climbing out of. And of course there's going to be overtime, not to rehash all of the arguments that have been had here before, but of course there's going to be overtime assigned, because when a system like this doesn't hire staff to put out service and to get the system into a state of good repair, the only alternative is to dole out overtime. And you reflect that in your report, and I appreciate that. And on page 33 of your report, you also say that none of this overtime was fraudulent. You're not making any kind of assessment that the overtime was fraudulent. So April 24th, the Empire report comes out. In the May meeting, and in the lead up to the May meeting, we have the finance chair of the MTA committee going on to television talking about a common thread of rampant overtime fraud and abuse, of which there's still not one iota of proof that's brought forward at all whatsoever. Nothing. And not in this report. And I understand you say it wasn't your intent to address this, but nonetheless, that specter is out there, and it's now being echoed with an initial comment that there's inappropriate overtime being doled out. There's not one lick of evidence that inappropriate overtime has been rampantly doled out. In fact, the evidence suggests the exact opposite, which is that the system fell into a state of disrepair. The MTA didn't want to hire the staff. And then when you don't hire staff and you want to get the system back into a state of good repair, you have to pay out overtime. And that's what this is all about. And then the second thing is, you even note in your report, I can't reference the page, but you note in your report that the MTA should rethink their hiring freeze, because all that's going to lead to is more overtime being doled out to keep the system in a state of good repair. And what a travesty that is, that right where we're on the cusp of getting the system into a state of good repair, there's a hiring freeze that potentially jeopardizes the state of good repair. And ironically, the only way to maintain that state of good repair in the midst of a hiring freeze is to pay out overtime. So this becomes a cyclical thing. You'll be here 2 years from now talking about the amount of overtime that was paid out during the period of a hiring freeze in order to maintain the system in a state of good repair. And I have a question for you. You began, and it's also in the report, by saying that you didn't investigate MTA headquarters. Why wouldn't you investigate MTA headquarters when MTA headquarters is a very likely place where fraud and corruption exists, rather than within the unionized workforce? Who gave you the instruction not to investigate MTA headquarters? By the way, where there is no effective time and attendance system whatsoever.
So thank you for your comments. So no one gave us any limitations on what we could look at, other than we were to look at systemic and procedural policies related to overtime, attendance, and timekeeping. We set forth in our report why we did not look at MTA headquarters, because it had low overtime, and it also includes the MTA PD, which is just functionally very different than the other agencies that comprise the MTA.
So fraud at the MTA certainly would not only include overtime, it would include people getting paid for jobs that they don't do. And particularly in a place where there is no codified time and attendance reporting system, this building that we're in is the most egregious offender across the entire system. But you've given a rationale as to why you didn't do that. You focused on the workers rather than on MTA headquarters. And if you continue to do this, and you continue to go on, as I think Kevin suggested, that perhaps we need a permanent council, it would be a super good thing to look at MTA headquarters, and in particular, and especially since we've now established that there are appropriate drivers which provide explanation for the amount of overtime that was doled out to the unionized workforce. And just the second thing I want to point out, and I do appreciate you saying it, it's on the bottom of the first page, I believe, that the overtime failures arose at all levels of the MTA leadership, including management and the MTA board. So this very board here. And the great irony of all of this is that this whole thing began when the chairman of the finance board, who's been here for 4 years, looking at all these overtime reports week in, week out, month in, month out, didn't do a damn thing about it until the Empire Center report came out, and then he ran scared and ran to the media and blamed the workers. And here we are, even after the call for a special prosecutor was initially voted down by the MTA board in executive session outside of the purview of the public, which it should have been done in. It was voted down initially. I'm not even sure if you're aware of that. It was voted down, and yet it was hammered back down everybody's throat. And anybody at the table who denies that is living in a fantasy. That's exactly what happened.
Hey, John, can I ask you to wrap up in 1 minute? There are others who want to speak, and I'll come back to you if that's okay.
I will wrap up, and I'll wrap up by saying that I very much appreciate the report because, by and large, it's an absolute vindication of the unionized workforce here, and it lays the blame appropriately at this MTA board, and I would put forth that at the chair of the Finance Committee. So thank you.
The answer is that currently, based on the procedures and the policies, the MTA is not able to determine what is optimal levels of overtime, which overtime is economically feasible or advisable versus not, and the inability of the MTA to be able to figure that out is part of the problem that you just highlighted. And so one of the recommendations in our report is for the MTA to enable the metrics, to put in place the systems that would allow the MTA and this board to figure out how much overtime there is, how much is economically advisable so that you can better budget for it and plan for it accordingly.
Can I comment on that, please? First of all, the MTA has every ability to track the amount of overtime that they're doling out. We have, across all of our contracts, there's overtime caps. You recognize them in your report. There's overtime caps. If the MTA had no ability to track the amount of overtime that was being assigned, they'd have no idea when somebody hit the overtime cap or not. And in fact, you also acknowledge in the report that the MTA came to the unions and bargained with us to remove the overtime cap so they could assign us even more overtime than they already were. And that went into a state of buyer's remorse as soon as the Empire report came out, and everybody here scattered and got nervous about what their culpability was in the overtime. And I would also put forth that the MTA has every idea of how much overtime they need to achieve a state of good repair in the system. And that's, in fact, I find a bit insulting to the agency heads, which is okay by me if you insult them, but they have to know how much overtime they need to get the system into a state of good repair, because there's a calculus between hired staff and existing headcount and the work that needs to be done. So the difference, the overtime amount, is the difference in headcount versus work hours that need to be put in place to accomplish a state of good repair. So much of what you're saying is actually maligning the agency heads as if they don't know what they're doing and they have no idea how to assign overtime. And if that's the case, this goes even deeper than you suggest. It's insulting to the woman next to you, in fact, that runs subways.
So if I can briefly respond, as I stated initially, our job and what we did was to look at the facts objectively and present those findings to the MTA and to this board and to make recommendations that we thought address those findings. Of course, we were not.
Commissioner Samuelsen.
Yeah, I do want to say that the comments made by Board Member Mojica seem fairly responsible to me about appropriate overtime and whatnot. And Board Member Lacewell, when you spoke about the writing public having confidence in the appearance that overtime is being doled out properly, we agree with that as well. And I do want to drive home the point that the lack of confidence that the public most definitely has now is the person responsible for that is Larry, the chair of the Finance Committee, because on May 9th, the day before the special meeting, despite his denials, he was on CBS News ranting and raving in an inappropriate, hyperbolic manner about rampant abuse and fraud among transit workers.
That's
And
not true,
was
John. You should
absolutely
read.
inappropriate.
Watch.
And the next,
Why don't you
interrupt me because I didn't
read
interrupt
the
you.
transcript?
Guys,
Don't interrupt me.
and watch
All
the
right, so don't
segment
interrupt me.
because you never
You
read.
can
You never
rebut me.
watched it. You never
Yeah,
read the
I've
transcript.
watched it,
If you
and
read it,
transcripts all over
you'd
watched it
know
and were
that what you
nauseated
just
by
said
it.
is a lie.
So
Stop,
it's
stop,
not a
stop,
lie.
stop.
And in
One
fact,
at
I'm
a
not
time.
done yet. In fact, on May 10th, at the special board meeting, he followed up his news commentary by laying out a whole bunch of nonsensical accusations that he believes supported there was a rampant fraud. And he did, one after the other, one after the other, and one after the other. So the appearance
cited
that there
IG
are
reports,
problems-
John.
The appearance that there are problems with overtime were triggered by you. It's at your feet. And you know what? There's blood on your hands because transit workers were assaulted in the aftermath of your accusations about rampant fraud, which you
I'd ask-
still have not produced a lick of evidence about. No evidence, no nothing.
John,
And contrasting you to Board Member Mojica, spoke very responsibly. You spoke hyperbolically.
Can we have decorum
just
here,
in a
Chair?
completely
You should not
anti-worker
permit
manner.
this to go on.
You're the one who's inappropriate here. I'm sorry, I missed everything you said because you interrupted me. You might not like it that I'm critical of Larry Schwartz. I understand that people think they're not supposed to be critical of Larry Schwartz.
No, but hang-
You could be critical of me, John. You just got to tell the truth.
hang on a second.
I got to tell the truth.
Commissioner Schwartz.
The whole room is laughing at that comment.
Commissioner Schwartz. Okay. Commissioner Lacewell.
I would ask, and I see other members of the board doing the same, that the chair enforce appropriate decorum. People can express themselves, they can criticize, but this is not productive, it's not professional, and we are a fiduciary board that needs to be able to debate with some level of civility. And I'd ask the chair to please enforce that.
I have a question. What was inappropriate about my comments? That you didn't like what they were? Because I didn't interrupt anybody, yet all the other members of the board,
Point of
the
order.
non-union members of the board who have not been targeted, interrupted me. Yet I didn't interrupt anybody. So what's the problem with my decorum? In fact, Chairman Foy, I would ask that you instruct the other members of the board not to interrupt the union when the union is defending our members who have come under an absolutely unfounded, inappropriate attack driven by a false narrative
No, we're not gonna take a break.
produced by Larry Schwartz.
We're not going to take a break. Commissioner Lacewell. Commissioner Brown.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Norman.
Yeah, turn-taking is one of the most basic elements of human discourse. You're supposed to learn it in kindergarten. I get angry at a lot of things people say here. I strive not to interrupt them. This is not Fox News. We should not be talking over each other. John had the floor, and unless Pat says, unless you have a point of order, point of information, if you have a point of order which would require a vote for some procedural thing we'd mix up, it's his responsibility whether to break into what he's saying or not. If he's out of order, it's up to the chair to make that decision. But interrupting them, talking over them, does, I don't know which one of you said, but it leads to a very negative, non-fiduciary, I mean, how do you have good faith in somebody that's interrupting you? I make lots of statements, and I make lots of wrong statements, and I expect you to correct them, but I expect you to let me make my mistakes by myself rather than talk over me, so we argue. John had the floor. You should have let him alone.
Any other comments on this, or can we wrap this up? Andrew.
I think everybody around the table is all for finding ways to combat fraud if there's fraud, make sure that overtime is manageable and is done in the proper way, and particularly if that will end up saving the agency money, because I was a little alarmed, Pat, at your opening statement about coming service reductions this fall, which I had not heard about prior to that. It seems to me that the Alex partners, one of the things they emphasized was the last thing they wanted to touch, and all of their savings were meant so that service would not be harmed. So I was a little
Yeah,
alarmed.
so Andrew, 2 points. I didn't, I said that about the subway and bus service adjustments because I thought the public ought to be told and I thought the board ought to be informed. I think on a positive note, Mr. Samuelsen endorsed Mr. Mahika's comments. I think that's an important thing. I think that Mr. Commissioner Mahika's comments were well said, and I think may represent the opportunity to kind of go forward on implementing both the substance and the tone and the spirit of his comments.